In 2014, a psychologist sat dog owners in their living rooms and asked them to do something strange. Pet a stuffed animal, not their real dog, a fake one that whined and wagged its tail when you touched it. Cameras rolled. Within seconds, most of the dogs pushed between their owner and the toy. Some barked, some snapped at it. One dog tried to physically shove the stuffed animal off the owner's lap. The researchers had not expected this, because what they were watching, frame by frame, looked exactly like something you have felt. That tight, hot feeling in your chest when someone you love gives their attention to someone else. You know this feeling. You have lived it since you were a child, maybe since before you could speak. But what you are about to discover is far stranger and far more personal than a dog protecting its owner. Because the question isn't whether animals compete for attention, it's whether they feel the same ache you do when they lose it. Think about the last time you felt jealous. Not petty jealousy over something small, the real kind, the kind that makes your stomach drop. Where did that feeling come from? Psychologists used to have a simple answer. Jealousy, they said, requires a story. It requires you to imagine another person's inner world, compare it to your own, and feel wronged by the comparison. That takes a highly developed brain, a human brain. Under that definition, animals could not be jealous. They could only be territorial, possessive, competitive over food or mates, nothing more. But the woman running that stuffed dog experiment, Christine Harris at the University of California, San Diego, wasn't satisfied with that answer. She wanted to know if jealousy was something deeper than a story we tell ourselves, something older, something built into the body before language ever showed up to explain it. So picture the scene again. A dog owner sits on the floor. In front of them, a stuffed dog that moves and makes noise. The real dog watches its owner's hands stroke a rival who isn't even alive, and something ignites. Not slowly, immediately. The dog's ears pin back. Its body tenses. It inserts itself into the space between the owner and the toy, again and again, as if trying to physically erase the rival from existence. Now here's the detail that should stop you cold. When the same owners petted a completely non-social object instead, a plain bucket or a book, the dogs barely reacted. It wasn't the owner's attention itself that triggered the response. It was the owner's attention going to something that looked like a rival for affection. The dog wasn't just protecting a resource, it was protecting a bond. Do you see what that means? A dog cannot tell you a story about betrayal. It cannot compare its own worth to another dog's worth in words. And yet its body did something that looked, moved, and behaved exactly like jealousy. The tensing, the insertion behavior, the aggression aimed specifically at the rival, not at the owner. If you didn't know it was a dog, you would swear you were watching a sibling walk in on a parent hugging someone else. So maybe jealousy isn't a story after all. Maybe it's older than stories. Maybe it's a survival system. Here is the deep biology behind it. In humans, jealousy activates a very specific network in the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex and the lateral septum, regions tied to social pain and attachment. Neuroscientists have found that watching a loved one bond with someone else lights up nearly the same circuitry as physical pain. Jealousy, in other words, is not a moral failing or a childish tantrum. It is your brain treating the loss of connection like an injury. And that circuitry did not appear out of nowhere in humans. It evolved from something far older, attachment systems that exist across social mammals, built to keep offspring close to caregivers and keep bonded pairs close to each other. If your ancestors' babies wandered off unbothered whenever a caregiver's attention shifted elsewhere, those babies were more likely to be left behind, forgotten. The infants who protested, who fought to keep the bond intact, survived more often. Jealousy, at its root, may not be about pride or ego at all. It may be an ancient alarm system whose only job is to say, "Don't let this bond slip away." But that still leaves the harder question. Feeling threatened by a rival is one thing. That's territorial instinct. Actually feeling jealous, with something like an inner emotional experience, is another thing entirely. And that's where the story gets far stranger than a stuffed toy in a living room. Ethologist Mark Bekoff spent decades observing wild canids, and he documented something that pure instinct struggles to explain. In several social carnivore groups, individuals who were excluded from grooming or play didn't simply walk away and move on. They sulked. They approached the group repeatedly, were rebuffed, and then showed prolonged behavioral changes, reduced appetite, increased vigilance toward the preferred individual, even what looked like sustained low mood. That is not a quick territorial flare-up. That is something that lingers, something that looks less like a reflex and more like heartbreak. If you've made it this far, you already know you're not the kind of person who scrolls past this stuff. This channel exists for people exactly like you. Hit subscribe, and every week you'll find another piece of the animal world that makes your own instincts feel a little less mysterious and a little more understood. Now here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the same pattern doesn't stop at dogs. It shows up in animals we rarely think of as emotional at all. Researchers studying capuchin monkeys ran a now famous fairness test. 2 monkeys, side by side, both trained to hand over a small stone in exchange for a reward. When both received cucumber, both were content. But when one monkey started receiving grapes, a far more desirable treat, for the exact same task, the cucumber-receiving monkey didn't just lose interest. It threw the cucumber back at the researcher. It shook the enclosure. It refused to participate at all, even though cucumber had been perfectly acceptable moments before. Nothing about the cucumber changed. Only the comparison changed. And that comparison alone was enough to trigger outrage. That's not simple hunger. That's not simple competition. That is a creature comparing its outcome to someone else's outcome and reacting to the unfairness of the gap, which is, essentially, the emotional architecture jealousy is built from. But that's not even the strangest part. Elephants, orcas, and even some birds have been observed engaging in what researchers call triadic awareness, tracking not just their own relationship to another individual, but the relationship between 2 other individuals entirely. A young elephant will position itself between its mother and another calf she is nuzzling. A raven will interrupt the preening of 2 other ravens it is not even involved with. These animals are not just reacting to losing attention themselves. They appear to be monitoring bonds they are not even part of, as if the very existence of closeness between 2 others is information worth reacting to. Think about what that requires. To feel threatened by a bond you're not in, you need something like a mental map of who cares about whom. You need to notice that a relationship exists and that you are, or are not, inside it. That is a strikingly sophisticated piece of social cognition to find sitting quietly inside a bird's brain, or a calf barely a few weeks old. So where does that leave the science? Most researchers today land somewhere careful and honest. Full human jealousy, with its narrative of betrayal and its capacity for grudges that last years, likely does require the kind of complex self-reflection only a few species share with us. But the raw emotional core underneath it, the alarm that fires when a bond feels threatened, the physical tension, the drive to insert yourself back into closeness, that appears to be far older and far more widespread than we assumed. It may be baked into the basic architecture of any brain built for attachment, and that reframes something you've probably felt but never quite said out loud. If your dog has ever wedged itself between you and a new partner, a new baby, or even a laptop that's stealing your attention, it likely isn't being dramatic for no reason. It may be running the exact same ancient alarm system that made you feel a hot flush of unease the last time someone you loved got a little too close to someone else. Different species, different faces, possibly the same old circuitry underneath, quietly doing its job. There is something almost comforting in that, if you sit with it. It means you are not broken for feeling jealousy. It means that ache in your chest is not some embarrassing personal flaw you need to hide. It is a signal, shared across an enormous range of social creatures, whose entire purpose is protection, not of territory, not of pride, of connection itself. Think about how early this shows up in your own life. Long before a child learns the word jealous, long before they can explain why a new sibling makes their chest feel tight, they already know how to wedge themselves back into a parent's lap. Nobody teaches a toddler that behavior. It simply activates, the same way it activates in a dog, a monkey, or a raven. That's the part worth sitting with. The feeling arrived in you before the vocabulary did. The body understood the threat to the bond long before the mind had a name for it. Which means every time you've ever felt that flicker of unease, watching someone you love laugh a little too easily with someone else, you were experiencing something far older than yourself, something that predates language, predates culture, and very likely predates humans altogether. Nobody trained that dog to wedge itself into its owner's lap. Nobody taught that monkey the concept of fairness. Nobody explained betrayal to that raven, and yet each of them acted as if the bond mattered enough to fight for. Maybe that's the real discovery here. Not that animals feel exactly what you feel, but that the instinct to protect a bond, to notice when it's slipping away, might be one of the oldest and most universal emotional threads connecting you to almost everything alive. In 2014, a psychologist watched a dog throw itself between its owner and a stuffed toy, and called it jealousy. Today, you might watch yourself do something almost identical, and finally understand why. If you've ever felt something like this with an animal of your own, a pet nudging its way back into your attention, a moment that felt eerily human, leave a comment and tell that story. And if this changed the way you see the animals around you, a like helps this reach someone who needs to feel it too.